Today we have with us a special guest, Dr. Joy Harden Bradford, who is a licensed psychologist, speaker, and host of the popular mental health podcast Therapy for Black Girls, which I'm a huge fan of. So super excited to have Dr. Joy with us today. Her work focuses on making mental health topics more relevant and accessible for Black women, and she delights in using pop culture to illustrate psychological concepts. She's been featured all over the place. Essence, O Magazine, Huffington Post, Bustle, Refinery 29, all over the place. Dr. Joy, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
So, today we are going to be talking about, we're in the middle of our Thriving Over Surviving series where we're transitioning from just surviving into a thriving state because we deserve that. And the key piece to thriving over surviving is our mental health. And therapy is a great tool to help address some of those mental health concerns. So you're the perfect person to speak with us and our audience about this topic. So how did you get into this field? Like, what was the spark that got you into therapy or being a therapist?
Yeah, so I actually had the opportunity to take a psychology class in high school, and really just fell in love with the field. So I just thought it was so interesting. I'm somebody who is kind of naturally curious about human behavior and like why we do the things that we do. And so once I found like psychology, it was like, oh gosh, this is a perfect fit. Like you can do this as your work. And I actually thought that I wanted to be a professor. So I thought I wanted to kind of teach other people psychology. But then I had an opportunity to do a practicum where I like observed a therapist doing therapy and was like, oh no, this is actually what I want to do. And so since then, my background, a lot of my work history has been in college student mental health. And so, really helping young people or, younger Black women specifically to kind of really pay attention to their mental health and pay attention to things like setting boundaries and, how to really manage your emotions has been something that has been really important to me.
Everything we need. Are you currently practicing therapist now?
Yeah, so I do still have a very small caseload just because I really, really love doing therapy and I don't completely want to give it up. But much of my work now is, managing the podcast and those kinds of things.
Love when we can completely transition over to the entrepreneurial side of it because, being a therapist is admirable. It takes a lot of energy. What is the difference between therapy and a psychologist and a psychiatrist? Can you explain that?
This is a really good question because I think a lot of people, when they start looking for therapy, get really confused about like what all these different letters are behind our names, right? And so a psychologist, which is what I am, is somebody who typically has a doctoral degree. So you can either have a PhD or a PsyD, which is a doctor of psychology. And those are typically people who have gone to school for probably 4+ years and have a terminal degree in the field. But they typically will do things like therapy or assessments or psychoeducation, like those kinds of things. A psychiatrist is somebody who's actually gone to medical school. So these are people who can actually prescribe medications. Sometimes they do also do therapy, but primarily they are looking at, like medication and like helping you to kind of manage your mood or manage whatever your symptoms are related to medication.
So with that process, like, I know there's some people who just feel like they know their mood is off and it needs to be regulated and they just want to go straight to meds. What is the process? Do you have to speak with a therapist first, or can you just go straight to a psychiatrist and say, give me some meds, I know that I need them?
Yeah, so you can go straight to a psychiatrist. Now, the psychiatrist psychiatrists will still talk with you about what's going on and make an assessment about whether they actually think that you need medication. So just because they can prescribe doesn't mean they always will, depending on what's going on with you. And the research has been really consistent that for a lot of things, the combination of both medication and therapy are what's going to best help you. So even if your psychiatrist does say, okay, I'll give you this prescription to help manage whatever symptoms you're having, they might also suggest that you work with a therapist in conjunction with taking the medication.
Tandem, you need
You
both.
need both, yeah.
The medication
Yeah.
that you need to sit down and speak to somebody.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Joy, you mentioned that right now you have a relatively small caseload because you're focusing so much on the podcast Therapy for Black Girls. Can you tell
Mhm.
us about the show, what inspired you to start the podcast, and how you got here?
Yeah, so before Therapy for Black Girls was my full-time job, I was the director of the counseling center at Clark Atlanta University. And my commute there was like an hour both ways. And
Hmm.
so I fell in love with listening to podcasts. So The Read, which I'm sure a
Mhm.
lot of people are familiar with, right? I feel
Mhm.
like that's how a lot of us kind of got into
Yes.
podcasting. That was one of my favorite shows, and I just thought it was so hilarious. And I was already blogging on the Therapy for Black Girls website, but once I found podcasts, I thought, oh, wow, this would be a great thing to add to the blogs that I'm already doing, because it feels like, it would be a great way to maybe reach other people who prefer to listen to their content. And my husband actually has a background in like radio production. And so I knew he could help like produce the show, and I wouldn't have to like go out of the house really to get those services. And so, I just thought like, okay, let me try this. I took a course. So there is a psychologist who has a podcasting course that teaches you like all the basics you need to know, like how to upload a file, all that stuff that you don't hear when you listen to like somebody talking on a
Right.
podcast. So
Mhm.
I took his class, and then came up with a couple of ideas for like what the first couple of episodes would be, and I just put it out there.
Wow. And look at it now. It's blown up.
And look at
It
it now.
it is
Right,
huge.
right.
I told my mom today, like, we have an interview with Dr. Joy from Therapy for Black Girls, and she just loves
Mhm.
you. She was so excited. She was like, "Oh my god!" She was so excited. So you have reached
I love that.
far and wide, and we're very grateful because in the within the communities of color, there has been a stigma associated with mental health and speaking with the professional. It wasn't always encouraged, and thankfully,
Mhm.
it's being more encouraged. And we have platforms like yours that are tremendously helpful. So, with that stigma still being a thing, is there a
Mhm.
certain approach that you take when you're speaking with women of color when it comes to mental health?
Yeah, I really feel like you have just given me a great example of the work that I'm trying to do, right? So the fact that both you and your mom listen to the podcast, right? And so much of the stigma related to mental health, especially for Black women and women of color, is related to the fact that we are sometimes like the first ones in our family who might be
Mhm.
going to therapy, right?
Mhm.
Yes.
And so the fact that you both could have this content, right? Like you could talk about an episode, it really allows you to bridge that gap, and it makes it more accessible and makes it easier to have some of these conversations that you and your mom maybe never would have had if you like couldn't come around a podcast episode, right? And so I really love that people use the podcast episodes in that way. So maybe there's a conversation you want to have with like your mom or your aunt, and you don't quite want to say it, but you could say, oh, did you hear this latest episode? Dr. Joy's talking about like boundary setting. And then it
Mhm.
opens up this whole conversation, and you're really kind of focused on the content as opposed to maybe directly saying like, hey, I don't like it when you do this thing, right? When you get to
Right.
Yes.
that place. But you can start with the podcast episode. And so I think that that really has done some incredible things in really breaking down that stigma. I think also one of the big things, or the main factors that has led to stigma in our community, is like religion and spirituality. And so
Mhm.
I think for a very long time, people felt like, if you needed to talk to a therapist, that meant you weren't praying hard enough, or that you had a weak relationship with, whoever you are, whatever faith community you're a part of. And we of course know that that's not true. And so I think the more we have conversations about this, I'm really excited and encouraged to see so many like faith leaders bringing therapists into their congregations to have a conversation about mental health. So I really think the more that we talk about it, the more we kind of chip away at that stigma that still exists.
Yeah.
Definitely. I know that personally, my mom, she just started going to therapy, which she's so happy about. She's like, I was talking to my therapist. And I'm like, girl, I'm glad because we all need someone to speak to about it. But I feel
Yeah.
like currently millennials and people who are a little younger are a little more open to the idea of
Hmm.
therapy just because we are growing up in this more progressive, forward conversation or around conversations and dialogues around mental health and mental wellness and self-care where our parents are like kind of just get into the party. And
Hmm.
it's really nice, like you said, that we have these opportunities to talk with mental health professionals and open up the door and bridge the gap so that it creates a better dynamic between our parents and I to talk about tough conversations. You know what I mean? Like she's
Hmm.
talking about things that she's healing from and I'm sharing my opinion with her. So, it's really, really a beautiful thing to see how far we've come with like mental health and wellness.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I'm here for it. And
Yeah.
that's really what we want to talk about today. A lot of the times what drives us into therapy are our relationships, and it can be like platonic relationships, parental relationships, a lot of the time like romantic relationships. And in order to thrive, there are some things that have to be like unpacked and uncovered and healed in those relationships, which a therapist is the perfect place to have those conversations, because sometimes we don't know why we do the things that we do. And I've been
Hmm.
to a therapist. I want to find a new one because through our sessions, I realized that that therapist wasn't a good fit for me. But some things
Hmm.
were uncovered for sure. Some questions that I had, and we started with childhood. It started with parental relationships, and I'm like, here we go. So we want to talk today about father wounds and mother wounds, because we feel like once we address those, we will notice like a turnaround in the way we show up for others and how we can communicate to other people for them to show up with us. So, in your conversations and through your work, have you noticed like a lot of people are faced with father wounds and mother wounds?
I think that a lot of people are, but not everybody, right? And so when we talk about like this language around like mother wounds and father wounds, what we're really talking about is like ruptures in those very early relationships. And so, of course, that can be with your parents, but it also could be with whoever your early caregivers were, right?
Mm.
So when you're a baby and there's no language, you're really depending on your caregivers to kind of do everything for you. And so the way that that relationship develops and whether you feel secure and attached in that relationship really can dictate and kind of determine what your relationships will look like in later life. And so when we're talking about there being wounds in some of those early relationships, that's what you're referring to. So definitely, that does come up for a lot of people.
What would you say are some examples or some symptoms of having these like parental pains, even if we don't have to call them wounds or ruptures or whatever, mother pains, father pains? What would you say some symptoms or some examples of these wounds would be?
Hmm. So sometimes, like the parent was completely absent, and so we know that not having some of those people there in early life can really cause some difficulties later in your life with like attachment and feelings of abandonment. So that's one. Having a caregiver who was kind of checked out, so maybe they were physically there, but like were always working or always preoccupied with other kinds of things. That's something else that we will sometimes see. Also, parents or caregivers who have been abusive in lots of
Mhm.
different ways. So whether that is physical abuse or verbal abuse, you will also see some ruptures in relationships related to those kinds of dynamics.
Mhm. Mhm.
Some deep shit.
Mhm.
I I've mentioned on this podcast before how I definitely have acknowledged that I have father wounds because my father was absent for the majority of my life. He just
Mhm.
came back into my life like a year, over maybe going on 2 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because I was listening to your podcast with the therapist. I believe his name was Nick, who was
Mm-hmm.
talking
Nick
about
Hardy.
father-daughter relationships. And that was
Yeah.
such a good such a good conversation because um he was talking about how we have these expectations for our parents, and we expect for them to be met, and they're not. And then in adulthood,
Right.
when your parents sometimes re-enter, you still have that expectation, and you're like, okay, so you're here now. That's how I felt. I'm like, okay, you're here now. You've re-entered. This is how
Mm-hmm.
I'm expecting you to show up. And I was let down. And I like
Mm-hmm.
how you said that you have to like release that expectation
Yeah.
and figure out the best way to heal. So my question to you would be, what are some ways that we can work on our healing when we realize that an expectation that we have for a parent is not going to be met?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing that has to happen is that you have to verbalize that expectation, because a lot of times what happens, and this can be in, parent-child relationships, but in any of our relationships, we will often have expectations, but we don't actually verbalize it, right? So we get
Mm-hmm.
into this thing of wanting somebody to read our mind, or, oh, they are this person, and so they should just know that I need this thing or I want this thing. And that may be the case, but in other cases, they don't know unless you tell them. And so I think anytime we have a conversation about expectations, the first place we need to look at is whether you've actually verbalized that expectation. Now, if you verbalize that expectation and, kind of set some parameters for like how you want somebody to show up in your life, and they don't, then I think that you then have to look at what kinds of boundaries you need to set in relationship to that person to keep yourself emotionally safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you are setting yourself up for failure when you continue to have expectations for someone and they've shown you that they can't do or be whatever it is you're asking them to be.
That's gospel, the
That's good.
communication piece.
Yeah. Do you feel like you've done that? Do you feel like you've
No,
said
I feel like I feel like I definitely didn't do that because like you said, in my mind I'm thinking you're the parent. Like
Right.
why do I have to communicate to you what's expected of a parent? It should be automatic, but I guess there's
Hmm.
some unfairness there because there's a certain way that I know that I need you to show up for me. So
Right.
I guess I'm doing a disservice to myself and to him by not just directly saying, you know what, I
this is
get
what I
it. You know,
need?
there was a disconnect. There's been a lot of space
Hmm.
and time, but this is how I need you to show up so that we can have a stronger relationship or a relationship at
Hmm.
all. So I get that.
Yeah,
And it's funny because that translates beyond the parent child relationship. That's in all
for sure.
relationships. Like, you know, your expectations,
Mm-hmm.
you have to clearly state them and allow the other person to show up. And then if they don't, then that's when you can make the decision on if you want to continue on or if it's not going to be a fit. So
Yeah.
Mhm,
I
I
like
mhm.
think.
that.
Yeah, and in the case, you and your dad, you're
Mm-hmm.
not a minor child, right? And so the things that you might have needed when you were like 10 years old are going to be very different than what you need at this age, right? And in addition to him being your parent, you are also like in some ways kind of developing a relationship with a stranger, right? And you're a young adult, and so you can't just expect that he will like automatically know how to parent you when
Right.
really it sounds like there's still a process of you all still getting to know one
Very true. A stranger in my
another. Yeah.
house.
The inner child
Yeah.
work. Now you're reparenting. God damn, who want to reparent and a nigga here? Like
Right.
I
Like
don't want to.
now, I'm God. I just wanted to be a kid.
Or why do I gotta reparent and you're
Yeah.
present?
Yeah.
It's so funny. The speaking about father wounds and even mother wounds. For a long time, I didn't think that I had. I didn't think that I had any. I just was like, oh, my dad died when I was very, very young, like 6 months.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
I didn't internalize it being a father wound as much as I
Right.
internalized it as like something was taken from me.
Mhm,
I didn't want to say, oh no, I really do have daddy issues or a father wound. And up until recently, this year, actually, I realized,
mhm,
oh, there's some pieces of me that are missing there that hurt because of the absence of a father, whether it was voluntary or involuntary. And the more that I, grow and mature, I'm even noticing I have a really great relationship with my mom, but then there's also some pieces in our relationship that have a pain for me, I guess, a little bit. And well, I'd like the way you mentioned it, ruptured, called it rupture, like little hiccups, because my mom is her own person and she's healing and doing her own work, right? And then there's these pieces in our relationship that have trickled over into and impact me the way that I mature and adult am just in general. And I've noticed that like I'm like pretty fearful and afraid to do certain things because of my mom, and I'm learning to kind of cut that little umbilical cord that keeps us that keeps me so reliant on her and her nurturing the way she's mothered me. And I had this recent interaction or recent experience where I moved, but I didn't want to tell my mom that I had found a place and I was going to see it because I was afraid that she would tell me not to go or not to do it. And I've noticed that within my own mother wound, or whatever we want to call it, that a piece of my healing and growing is learning my autonomy or learning my independence away from like my parent. Have you noticed that, or does that seem like something in the mother wound category?
Well, I mean, I think mother wound or not, that feels completely developmentally appropriate for where I assume you are in life, right? So I don't know your exact age, but
32.
kind of okay. So
I'll be 33 soon.
17, 18 through like our early, 30s is when we are kind of becoming like who we're going to be, right? And so, whether there has been a rupture in that relationship or not, you are kind of developing separate from your family. And so definitely, given this kind of a family history, I mean, of course, mom is not here, but I'm sure that there is lots of anxiety and grief and lots of different things that developed as a result of the loss of your dad, right? And so, of course, her parenting may have been a little bit more anxious because she suffered this huge loss and was also colored by grief. And so, I am sure that those are difficult kinds of things. And I hope that y'all can have that conversation, right? Because I think it's very telling for you to like be able to recognize for yourself, like, I'm anxious about telling my mom this, and why should I be, right? So you kind of doing what you need to do for yourself. But I also think it's an opportunity for you to talk with mom about, hey, I've noticed this thing comes up in our dynamic and I want to talk about it, and given that mom is in therapy, now may be a great time to try to have that conversation.
Yeah, that seems like it makes it easier. It's like you
understand now.
You're getting healed.
You should
speaking with someone.
Because I just want to say, girl, I didn't. That is how I told her. I said, girl, I couldn't tell you, child. I just had to show up. I just had to do what I had to do, honey, because you were gonna stress me out. As soon as I told her where, she was like, oh no, that ain't no good over there. That ain't no good. You don't want to be over there. And then I'm like, look at me here.
Yeah, and it's fine.
And it's fine. And I'm doing great. And something else was funny. My grandma did the same thing. She was like, I just want to ask you. So my boyfriend's name is Andres. She was like, is Andres moving in? Has he moved in? And I wanted to say why. Right. I wanted to say, you guys, I'm 30, about to be 33. Just leave me alone. Right. If he is, so what? I said no. She said, oh, thank God. I know she's older school. She, she don't want me shacking, but dang, I want to be like, stay out of my business, y'all.
And that's that through like my learning and doing the work, I've been able to have some grace by looking at family history and realizing like where the roots come from when it comes to mothers, because my mom's in therapy too, and she has been like, she talks to me about most of her sessions. I'm like, okay, I'm here for it because I'm learning more about you through like, her sharing that. So I'm thankful that she wants to share with me. But I'm learning more about like her relationship with my grandmother, her mother, and it allows me to have more grace because it's like, this was the deck that you were presented with, right? And you still were a great mother, but I can see why like some things were the way that they were, and it makes me have more grace for my grandmother as well because there's roots there too. So we can acknowledge that there's work that we need to do and there's some things that like we didn't prefer, but also have grace at the same time, which I think everybody deserves. And it also helps us have better relationships because nobody is perfect. Like when you become a parent, you don't just have all the answers and all the tools to raise up perfect perfect children. Like, everyone's going to make mistakes, but
and you don't just stop being your own person.
you just don't.
You know, I feel like that's another thing. We just look at our parents as like just my parent. You are not your individual self. So you need to show up ready to go, healed, whole, whatever you got to do to fix it so that I'm not impacted by it, you know. But ultimately, I think we could just acknowledge that we're all going to fuck somebody up and we've all been fucked up.
But thankfully, like, there's like opportunities to unfuck ourselves.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, like, okay, so I love the suggestion you made, or the thing you touched on in the beginning where you said, like, we can present something like a podcast episode to open up the floor for conversation. But what are some other tools that we can use to intro these difficult conversations that we want to have with our parents, to let them know, you kind of have me messed up, or I don't like when you do this, or we need to address this so that we can have a healthy relationship moving forward, because there's tension here. There's so many broken mother-daughter, father-daughter, mother-son, like, relationships. And I know that we have these yearnings in our heart for, like, them to be better, but some of us just don't know where to start. So, like, what are some ways, if you can offer any, that we can, like, start these conversations to move towards healing?
So I just want to go back to the conversation around grace and like really um pay attention to that, because I think that that is so important. And I think you have to be careful though, like it is a both and, right? Like you can acknowledge that there are some ways that maybe your caregivers or parents really, hurt you, right? And that's incredibly painful. And you can understand the context, right? So getting some of this family history and understanding like, oh, this is why they did the things that they did, so you can understand the pain of the relationship maybe your mom had with her mom, and now see like, oh, okay, I see where that comes from, but that doesn't necessarily lessen the pain that maybe was inflicted upon you. So I think there's a way to kind of hold both of those things, and being able to have those kinds of conversations can ultimately lead to some healing. So I just wanted to underscore that part because I think it's really important. So to your current question though, of like how can you have some of these conversations, sometimes it might not need to be a conversation. Sometimes you may just need to move differently, right? So when we're thinking about like boundary setting, if you are kind of feeling like, okay, mom is calling me all the time, or auntie is calling me all the time, then you just start answering less, right? So it doesn't always have to be like this huge conversation about all the ways that you hurt me. Sometimes it is really just about you kind of restructuring your boundaries. And the other thing is that I think you cannot take on all of the responsibility for how the relationship might look different, right? So and this happens a lot when like we go to therapy, and but our parents and grandparents don't want to, is that you learn all of these new things about yourself and you want to like dive into all of these conversations. But if they have not done the work, or are not at a place where they can have those conversations with you, then you will maybe get a little frustrated because you'll be trying to push up against a wall that's not going to move. And so, if you feel like they're open to the conversations, then you can use something like a podcast episode or a blog post or a social media post or a book that you find, right? To kind of say, hey, this made me think about like our relationship. I wonder if you have some thoughts about it, or can we make some time to talk about it? But sometimes they are not going to be ready to go there with you, and it is no fault of your own. They're just not ready.
So we have to take accountability for ourselves.
Yes.
And not be so quick to try to fix, as opposed to implement the boundaries that we need to keep ourselves safe and secure. And not, I want to say, have people have us fucked up, but that'd be me.
Yeah.
I always want to do that. I feel like, and I need to probably stop doing this, that I always need to make sure that I'm not disrespected or like correct people when they try to disrespect me. Like, and it's not even disrespect, but I'd be like having to flex my own muscle. Like, wait, hold on.
Give an example of how you do that.
I had to do that this weekend. I had to do that. Okay, this happened. So I didn't talk to my mom, and I love this girl. I love her to death. Would give her this romper off my back. But I had a busy day. I did not feel well. I went out and got something to eat. I came home, and then my mom called me. I missed her call. I called back, and she was like, I'm feeling some type of way. And I'm like, what? And then
Mhm.
mind you, she's in therapy. So sometimes I have to bring her tools back to the forefront so that she can remember that she has them and they're
Right.
there for her to use. So I'm like,
Mhm.
what? And then she's like, I haven't spoken to you all day. You need to remember that no matter what, I am the mother, I'm the mom. Even if I don't call
Mhm.
you, you call me and check in with me. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Cause I feel like I've done my work. So I just can't have people talk to me any kind of way.
Right.
So I said,
Mhm.
Ma, hold on. Wait, I'm like, let's back up. What do you want to talk about? What did you want to talk about when you called? Well, I just wanted to call
Mhm.
and say I haven't heard from you. How's your day? I said, so let's start there. Let's go back there. And
Mhm.
she was like, no, 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 no. She wanted to just gang bang on me and tell me that she's the mother and flex her
Mhm.
black motherism. And I was like, that's not cool. And I feel like I'm
Right.
getting to this age where I have to be like, take away the mother daughter. Like, we got to be woman to woman. Like, I don't want,
Mhm.
and I don't know if that's a matter of just growing pains and understanding that I'm maturing and that the mother daughter dynamic, I love it so much. I love my mom. We're like besties majority of the time. But then there's
Mhm.
also this piece where I'm like, I have to continuously reinforce that, like, I am an adult, So if you
Right.
haven't heard from me you can call me too. I don't want to deal with that. I feel like that black parent thing that we have in our community that's like,
You
y'all
are
know what
always
it
in a
is.
child's
Yeah,
place.
you're
You're always
always
in
in
a
a child's
child's
place.
place.
Mhm.
And it's like, I'm actually
Mhm.
not in a child's place. I pay adult bills.
Yeah.
They
Right.
come in every month and I'm paying them. I
Mhm.
cannot be treated that way. I don't know if that's just like growing pains or what, but that's kind of where I feel
Mhm.
like that's where I'm identifying that I am right now. Cause I can't imagine her talking to me like that when I'm like 40.
Mhm. Yeah, and
Man.
I think it will be up to you to kind of keep reinforcing that boundary, right? So you started the conversation then, like, hey, this is not okay with me. And so every time she tries to do that, you will have to keep reminding her, like, this is not okay for me.
Man.
So it could be the kind of thing, it sounds like there's a real need for her to kind of want to do this checking in. And, I get some of that, like safety, especially given, again, a very early loss in her life. So that is probably driving some of that. So it could be the kind of thing where y'all establish like times where you're going to check in, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that kind of keeps away some of that needing to know everything because she knows on at 12 o'clock, every other day she's gonna talk to you, so that may be something else to try.
Yeah. Some tools.
Yes, the
Mm-hmm.
boundary piece.
It's the
Yeah.
boundary.
Yeah. Which can be hard because you don't want to seem disrespectful, but at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes parents are disrespectful too. And they have to
Mm-hmm.
realize that you can't talk to people any kind of way. You can't put your hands on people.
Mm-hmm.
And yes,
Right.
I was your child. I'm still your child, but I'm now an adult child. So we need to
Right.
function like adults because you don't just go putting your hands on other adults and talking crazy.
The putting your
Mm-hmm.
hands on.
No, I mean, I've seen it. I've seen it and it gets ugly. So,
Mm-hmm.
um
Yeah, we don't want that.
we don't
No.
want that. We want there to be respect at the forefront of
Always.
all of our relationships.
Yes.
Speaking of relationships, so um when we're in romantic relationships,
Mm-hmm.
what am I trying to say? Um, Obviously there can be some spillover of how we were raised and in how we operate in our romantic relationships. So, how
Mm-hmm.
important do you think it is to be healed from these parental ruptures before we enter romantic relationships? Is it impossible? Is it possible? Like, how do we navigate that space when we're in romantic
Mm-hmm.
relationships and either we have these parental ruptures or they have them? Like, should we be addressing them? Like, so what's your relationship with your parents? I need to know. And if it's bad, I'm out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I probably would not start off dating someone like that, right? Like that'd be the first date questions. That may be a bit of a turn off, right? But I do, and I don't necessarily think you have to be healed from these things to be in a romantic relationship because a lot of times you won't even know what some of those things are until you're in a romantic
Mm-hmm.
relationship. So, it's not all that they don't always show up only in romantic relationships, but romantic relationships are a lot of times where we see some of these triggers. kind of pop up. And so, sometimes you don't know that you have like issues with abandonment and stuff until there's a romantic partner and you're like, oh, I'm feeling something here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think you have to have done all of that work, but I do think some awareness could be good, right? So if you know that you've already had issues with a parent, then it is very likely that some of that could spill over into a romantic relationship. So I think awareness of what the potential issues are and an openness to work on like new things that pop up are really all that needs to happen. You don't have to be completely healed, so to speak, to be in a relationship.
So we can all breathe. One thing
Right.
though, I um I am very analytical and observant, and I guess I can sometimes it can be considered overstepping. I remember in a previous relationship, um he was like had anger issues. Like the arguments would like blow up and they would be too much. And so I remember in one
Mhm.
argument I was like, "Do your parents argue a lot?"
Probably not the best
He
time.
flipped and tumbled. I said, "Oh shit, I shouldn't have said that." It was really a
Mm.
question I wanted to know though, an answer to, because
Mhm.
I was trying to put pieces to the puzzle together to see
Not now.
if that's why this is your way to communicate. So he flipped.
Mhm.
He was like, "You trying to talk about my parents?" I'm like, "Bruh, not trying to talk about your
No.
parents. I'm just asking a
Mhm.
question." So
Right.
how would you say that if people like want to inquire about their partner's parental relationships, do you think
Mhm.
that that's something that we should do or should we stay away from? And if so, how should we go about that?
Mhm. Yeah, so probably not in the heat of an argument is probably not the time to
Yeah.
have that conversation. But I think once you know that a relationship is more serious, it's totally fine to like ask questions like, "Oh, tell me about your parents. Like, in what kinds of ways do they communicate? What did you observe of them? Maybe not that clinical of language, but like, like what kinds of things do they enjoy doing together, or like when they fight, what does that look like? Because I mean, making the assumption that most parents probably fight, or did you ever see your parents fight? Like what kinds of things did you see? So I think having those conversations in the like getting to know you kind of phase combined with like other things, feels pretty like typical to me, because you want to know like what kinds of dynamics they maybe have observed, because it very likely is informing how they show up in relationships.
Mm-hmm. You know, I dealt with two men with mother issues before, and after the first one, I should have known that that's probably not a role for me. I can't deal with
What was the role you
Mm.
felt you had to play?
their mother. That's
Oh,
how I felt. I feel
really?
like, yeah, like they both
Mm.
didn't have their mothers around. So the
Mhm.
relationship, well, one was a strained relationship and one was just an abandoned relationship. And being with men who are very, they were sensitive, I would say, very attached and tuned with their emotions. And then not having
Mhm.
that mothering relationship early on, someone who would be there to offer that like gentleness and nurturing, then growing up without it and getting to all of this, I said it's too much,
Mhm.
coming to me.
Mhm.
So, I mean, personally, um, that when I recognize somebody has some little mother issues, I'm like, ooh, this might be challenging. This might be
Mhm.
challenging. And both times it was. Both times I had to get out of there.
Yeah.
Were they aware of the mother issues or?
One of them probably didn't realize it, and the other one was still always very emotional and erratic. He probably just, I don't know. I
That's
said,
funny.
and I'm no psychologist, I'm no therapist, but I recognize that when I seen it. I'm like, your mother wasn't around when you were younger. I'm sure you're
Mhm.
dealing with something here, and you are requiring too much of me to fix it, right? There's an empty space there, and you want me to, I'm gathering you want me to fix it to make you feel
Right.
whole.
There's a part of that I get, but also the part that makes me feel like we both didn't have fathers. So I would hate for somebody to be like, "You didn't have a dad. I don't know about you." You know what
For
I'm
me though,
saying?
personally, is to me, I feel like if there hasn't been some workaround or you can't see you have mother issues, it's one thing to have father issues or recognize that there's a wound there versus relying on somebody and asking them to be everything that your father or your mother wasn't. And I feel like these particular people wanted me to be like very, very nurturing, extreme, like in a way that they probably are missing, that they need some inner child work to be done, is what I'm feeling.
Inner child.
I think so. They probably had to repair it themselves.
like we all do.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just what they needed from me at the time. I could not give.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
See?
that's important to know, right? Like whatever flavor, so to speak, people's issues show up as, if it's not a good fit for you, then it's okay to say that, right? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like we don't have to kind of take on other people's issues kind of just to be in relationship with them. There's an important piece of like recognizing what your limitations are and what kinds of things are going to be like too much for you, and whether you're willing to kind of do that work with the person or not. And it's okay to say that you're not.
Can't be your
I
therapist.
wasn't.
Can't be
I
your
said no.
therapist, King.
Can't be your therapist, and I can't be your mother, King.
Yeah.
Go
Right.
on.
I don't think yeah, it's tough. It's tough, and thankfully that there's mental health professionals to help guide us.
Mhm.
I just wonder, how many do you have to go through to where you find a fit? Because like I said, the one that I had, she had great intentions, but it wasn't a fit. I can tell that it wasn't a fit. And if I'm being honest, the work that I feel like it's going to take to find a fit, and this is an excuse, has deterred me from jumping back in, because I just feel like,
Mhm.
oh my God, is this going to be like dating? Like, why can't I just find a therapist that works? I send my little coins and then I come up healed. It's kind of intimidating. And I know that a lot of people can relate to that. And I guess what I'm asking for, like, what are some tips or suggestions to overcome that intimidation and just do what you need to do?
That's very fair. I mean, it is not always an easy process. And I think sometimes, especially if you've had like one kind of therapy relationship and it didn't do well, that sometimes leaves you feeling even more frustrated than like the first time you're trying to find someone. So I think it's important to acknowledge your feelings and to kind of, do an assessment of like, okay, do I feel like I can take on the energy of finding someone new right now? Because maybe you are not in a place where you feel like you can, but maybe in a month or two, you might be in a different place. So I think it's important to just acknowledge where you feel like you are, but to also keep in mind where you feel like a therapist could help to take you next. So when we're thinking about like who's going to be a good fit for us, it can, I know it is unfortunate, but it can be like a dating kind of thing, right? Because everybody is just not going to be a fit for you. So we know that the thing that makes therapy most successful is the relationship you have with your therapist. And so if it's just not a good fit, then it's probably not going to feel like successful therapy to you. So you may have to kind of do a little bit of dating around, so to speak, to find the therapist who is going to be a good fit for you. So I typically encourage people to do as much research as you can. So lots of therapists have websites at this point. You can kind of read more about who they are, what kinds of clients they work with. Lots of therapists are also active on social media or have a podcast, or they've been guests on podcasts, or they have videos out on YouTube. So you typically can find a little bit more information about therapists so that you can get a bit of a feel for their personality, but also what kinds of things they specialize in. So you don't want to just get stuck on the personality. You also want to make sure that this person has expertise in whatever is bringing you to therapy,
Mm-hmm.
because that is going to be really important. So if you are coming in with like a substance abuse concern or an eating disorder concern, and this person nowhere on their website or on their social media is talking about those things, then even if you love their personality, they might not actually be a good therapist for you because they might not have the right training to be able to do what you need to do.
I love that.
I love that.
That's great advice, because sometimes we do just go, Black woman looking for. That's what I want, a Black woman. And then
I know.
Black woman might not always be ready to meet your needs, because that
Right.
same situation happened to me. I feel like I've done a lot of the preliminary work, that I just need somebody to go deeper with me. And this specific therapist
Mhm.
couldn't really go, she wasn't really pulling out what I needed her to pull out.
Mhm.
So I'm going to be
Mhm.
using that advice going forward, because it's time. It's
I
time for me
know.
to get back
Mhm.
in there.
When I was listening to the
Yeah.
father-daughter episode that you did with Nick, I was
Mhm.
thinking, hmm, what about a Black man therapist? That might be
Mhm.
something to explore. I've been keeping my heart set on Black woman. Black woman, you need to know
Mhm.
how I feel. You
Mm-hmm.
need to be able to relate. I don't want to have to explain nothing extra to you. I just want
Mhm.
to get down to the business. But
Mhm.
I liked what that brother was talking, and I said, maybe I should
Yeah.
open up my mind to consider having a Black male therapist, because I do love the male perspective. And I mean, I can try it out. It doesn't mean that I would love it in that setting, but it doesn't hurt to explore and see like what I can gather from it. So I appreciate you for
and I
having
think that
him
that's
on.
important, especially if you know that you're coming in with like relationship concerns related to your dad. There are things that are going to likely happen between you and a Black man therapist that would not happen between you and a Black woman therapist, right? So generally we're all, trained in the same kinds of ways, but there is something about like the dynamic, right? Like who we show up in as in the room as. And so when you're sitting across from a Black man and you know that you already struggle with some issues related to your father, there are likely things that are going to come up in the relationship between the two of you that are going to be great for you to be able to work through. So I do think it's really important to kind of keep your mind open to, wow, this is what I thought I wanted, but this person actually activates this other piece that is really important for me to work on.
Yes.
Okay. We're in the directory now. Black man.
Just
Black man. Black. Bring your credentials.
therapist. Yeah, and
Black with credentials.
I love to see the Black men in mental health. We had a Black male therapist on our show before, and he provided us with great insight. So all of the Black mental health professionals killing it. We love you. We need you. Like, keep going, keep working, because
it's essential work.
It's essential, and it's life-changing.
Yes. And Dr. Joy, thank you so much for all of the insight that you've provided today, the work that you're doing with Therapy for Black Girls. Let our homegirls know where they can find you, how to get a hold of you, touch in and tap in with you.
Absolutely. So you can check out all the work that we are doing at therapyforblackgirls.com. You will find the directory there that you heard us talk about, as well as our weekly podcast that drops every Wednesday morning. We also have a community within Therapy for Black Girls called the Sister Circle. So for people who want to dig a little deeper into these topics or really get the support of other sisters, you can join us in the Sister Circle as well.
Love that.
Love that. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Joy. We appreciate you and the work that you're doing. Please keep going, because we need it.
Yes. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank y'all for having me.